Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah. I'm very excited, as always, to be with you for a second time this week to share a second interview with you. We have a returning guest, a returning author on the show today, which I love. I'm trying to do this more at the beginning instead of just at the end, so I would like to say, if you are not doing so already, please like, follow, subscribe on whatever platform you are listening to this podcast on. That way you will always know when there are new episodes. And if you are on social media, you can find the podcast on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and I love hearing from listeners. You can also leave a review, which really helps to get the podcast out to more listeners. So thank you in advance, or in retrospect if you've already done it, or if you, in advance if you have not already done any of those things. Just thank you in general. I hope your week is going well, this first full week of March, and reminder for those of you in the U.S. to spring forward this weekend. With cell phones and everything, it's not as hard to remember that, but for me it's always confusing because usually here in Portugal we're about a week off from the U.S. in terms of when we go on daylight savings time or end daylight savings time. This time it's a 3 weeks difference, so we are not springing forward until the last weekend of March, which is also Easter weekend this year. And that just confuses my poor brain because I know that I am 5 hours difference from the East Coast. I am 8 hours different from the West Coast. My family is in Mountain Time. I am 7 hours different from them, except for during the times when we are off because we either haven't started or stopped daylight savings time on the same date. So now I have 3 weeks of remembering that the U.S. has sprung forward, so it's now only 4 hours difference from the East Coast. I'll only be 6 hours different from Montana, where my family is from, and it's just too confusing. But anyway, don't forget to spring forward is really all I'm saying. We've only walked on Monday this week. That is not enough. I am missing my walks with my hubby and my dog. It is just not enough this week. Part of it has been we are really, really busy with things in the office, and part of it has been that it's been raining. I'm not upset with the rain. We definitely need the rain here, so I love it's currently raining right now. It's very gray and gloomy, but I love that we're getting the rain. We need it, but I'm missing my walks. So I have no walk update for you today, which is an update in itself, I guess. Let's talk about a book and an author. I am so happy to have Yi Shun Lai returning to the podcast. She was here. She was one of my first interviews. She's a friend of a friend, and now she has become a friend of mine. I am always happy to talk to her. She was first on the podcast in 2018. If you're interested in hearing that episode, the episode number is 63. So way back on March 8th of 2018. I just saw that, and so apparently, Yi Shun, it is your destiny to be on the podcast for your episode to air on March 8th, because here we are again, March 8th, 6 years later, and you have another episode. That is complete coincidence, but I kind of like the symmetry of it. So if you're interested in hearing that episode, you can go find it and listen to it as well. We talk about, of course, another of her books, and I'm very happy, as I said, to have her back. Today we are talking about her book, A Suffragist's Guide to the Antarctic, which I think is an intriguing title. If that doesn't get your attention a little bit, to say, wait, what is this book? Well, I'm going to tell you what this book is. Again, it's a suffragist's guide to the Antarctic. No, it's not a travelogue, although we talk about that in the interview. Here's the description. November 1914. Clara Ketterling-Dunbar is one of 28 crew members of the Resolute, a ship meant for an Antarctic expedition now marooned on ice 100 miles from the shore of the continent. An 18-year-old American, Clara has told the crew she's a 21-year-old Canadian. Since the war broke out, that's World War I, if you're keeping track, but if maybe you missed I said 1914. Since the war broke out, sentiment towards Americans has not been the most favorable, and Clara will be underestimated enough simply for being a woman without also giving away just how young she is. 2 members of the crew know her nationality, but no one knows the truth of her activities in England before the Resolute set sail. She and her suffragist sisters in the Women's Social and Political Union were waging war of a different kind in London. They taught Clara to fight, and now, even marooned on the ice, she won't stop fighting for women's rights, or for survival. In the wilderness of Antarctica, Clara is determined to demonstrate what a woman is truly capable of, if the crew will let her. So this is a young adult book. Clara herself is 18, although she's passing herself off as 21. This is an incredible young woman. She's certainly got some things that she is working through. Which one of us doesn't? And who of us at 18 was not working our way through some things? But she is determined, she is spunky, and she is brave. And she's in a situation that is not very typical, which is where we really get to see how people's personalities come out, right? How they face adversity. And she's facing a lot of adversity on multiple different fronts. It's a unique premise. It's not something, that I've read in a story before. I mean, just like I said, the title, A Suffragist's Guide to the Antarctic. Those are words that almost sound like a Mad Lib, right? And yet, they work. The story works. Clara, as a main character, is intriguing and interesting, and she holds your attention. I'm going to let Yi Shun talk about how this book came to be, why this Mad Lib of a title exists, and why it makes sense, because it does. It actually does. It's a really, really great story, and I think it's an inspiring story, and one that if you have young adult readers, you might want to recommend this book to them. It's got adventure, it's got all kinds of things. I'm going to turn this over to the interview so you can hear Yi Shun talk about her book instead of me. Again, the book is called A Suffragist's Guide to the Antarctic. The author is Yi Shun Lai. Hello, Yi Shun. I'm so happy to have you back on the podcast. How are you?
I am so happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me again.
You know what? I meant to look before we started to see, because you were one of my first early guests when I started the podcast. So I meant to look and see what day you were on the podcast, and I forgot to do it. But it's been I don't know, six years?
Let me think. We talked about Marty Wu, right? Mm-hmm. So that was my first novel. It came out in 2016, and we are now in 2024.
Oh, geez.
So yeah, it's been 8 years. But also, I'll tell you what, in a bizarre stroke of coincidence, I was in a hotel room when I was talking to you then in Florida, and I am once again in a hotel room, but this time in Oakland, California, where I'm here for a professional development conference. So, so we seem to be hotel friends, or just put it that way.
I did not know that about us.
Exactly. Now you know.
That's awesome. Where will you be in a hotel next time we talk? I'm looking forward to finding out the answer.
Oh gosh, I don't know. We'll have to project 8 years in the future when I write another book, right?
No, we're gonna. We won't put that out in the universe. The book will happen when it's supposed to happen.
Exactly. That's good to know.
Well, before we start talking about the new book, which is called A Suffragist's Guide to the Antarctic, would you mind just taking a few moments to share a little bit about yourself, so people maybe who heard the first interview and need a refresher, or people who are meeting you for the first time can get to know you a bit?
Yeah, thanks for providing me the space. I had to think about this for a long time, right? Because there are so many aspects to a personality. Probably the thing I most want you to know about me is that I live in California. I have an unruly pit bull mix named Huckleberry and an incredibly patient spouse named Jim. I work in higher education, and this book that's coming out will be my third book. I write both fiction and nonfiction, and just love it to pieces. And I'm just super glad to be here talking to you about this work.
Yeah, that's one thing that I love about you is that you write in such a wide variety of spaces. You write fiction, you write nonfiction. This book is very different from the first book we talked about.
Yeah.
Do you tend to write just as the mood strikes you, or how does that process work for you to determine, are you writing nonfiction today? Are you writing in a different genre today?
So, okay. So, there's that thing about like, don't be a one-trick pony. I'm totally a one-trick pony. And I know that sounds funny given what you've just said, but the reality is I write about what I'm curious about. It was Mark Twain who said, write what you know. But I write towards what I'm curious about. Okay. Or what I'm trying to understand. And for me, it has always been a question of, simultaneously where we fit in this world and also where the world will let us fit. Marty Wu was very much about a woman trying to make her own way in a world that had two standards for her, right? She's an immigrant, and she's very much living in America, and she's trying to figure out what parts of her are American and what parts of her are Taiwanese. My memoir is about me not fitting in as a woman of color in the outdoor sports world. And this book is quite obviously about a suffragist on board an expedition that was clearly not meant for women. Or that's what the men told themselves anyway. So, there is, even though I'm writing across these genres, there is still this sense of really trying to understand what it is that makes some people see us as being other or not belonging. And the things we do to move toward that belonging that are within our capacities to do so, right? So do you see what I'm saying? Like, I mean, this is kind of like there's a bit of a I don't know, like I said, a bit of a one-trick pony-ness about me,
See, but again, I don't see it that way because I mean, I understand where you're coming from, but from the outside perspective, I think it's great that you look into things that you're curious about and then you go from there. So I think that's a good jumping off point, frankly.
Good.
So it is, as we've said, a suffragist's guide to the Antarctic. Can I start off by saying I'm so glad it's suffragist and not suffragette because I have an irrational dislike of that word.
Yeah. And I don't know if your listeners will know this, but like you clearly know it. Suffragette was this sort of, I almost said patronymic, but that's something from my Russian lit class that I took 30 years ago. Oh my goodness gracious. We were just talking about perimenopause brain. Like, how does this happen? Now, how come I'm pulling these things up from 30 years ago? It is sort of the derogatory term for suffragist, right? And the great thing about this is that the suffragists actually took that word back. They started calling themselves suffragettes just to kind of like, stick it in the eye of the man. And I love that about it, but it was actually quite a battle for me to figure out whether I should call it suffragettes or if I call it suffragists. And at the end of the day, because my heroine is extremely earnest. She takes this stuff very, very seriously. So at the end of the day, I thought about it from her point of view and went with suffragist instead.
Yeah, that makes sense. I spent a lot of my time, I can never remember if we've talked about this, but I went to a Lutheran seminary. That's where I got my master's degree. I know a lot of people who are Lutheran pastors, and there are people who think that calling female pastors pastorette is hilarious, and I just want to reach across and flick them in their forehead.
Well, hold on. I'm sorry. I just need a minute to process that. Seriously? Like, and like this is still going on, right? This is a thing that's still going on?
Yes. Unfortunately.
Oh, I'm dying now. I'm dying. That is legitimately terrible. Wow. Yeah. Sorry to hear that. Okay. We need to start a movement around that because that's really disgusting.
Just stop putting "et" on the ends of.
Seriously. I mean, it's the equivalent of patting somebody on their head and saying, "Oh, you're so pretty today." Right? Like what? Oh, yuck. Okay. I guess I'm sorry to hear that. Yeah. So I understand why suffragette would be triggering for you then. Definitely. My goodness gracious.
Yeah. But can you give an overview of Clara's story?
Yeah. So, Clara is a young suffragist who is, actually American, although she passes herself as Canadian, in order to, kind of like reach her, ideal of equity, she participates in the American movement first. And then when they're not doing enough, she goes to England, and arrives pretty much just in time for the English suffragist movement to roll over to support World War I. Rolling over, that's her words, not mine, by the way. I don't quite see it that way. So then, of course, she's furious, as you do. She then signs up for an Antarctic expedition that just happens to be helmed by a guy who is just bananas enough to take a woman on board. She does not do the thing that happens in a lot of fictional reworkings of these things where she disguises herself as a man. And I made that decision very, very deliberately. I didn't want the crew to get to not acknowledge the fact that she was a woman, if that makes sense, right? I wanted them to be faced with that fact first and foremost, so that we would be able to see their true colors right away. And, as it turns out, their ship sinks. And so they have to spend some time on the Antarctic continent and the Antarctic waters. And it's there that she has to figure out whether or not she can actually make a go of this thing. The book is pegged to Ernest Shackleton's Endurance Expedition, on which he got 28 men back alive after 2 winters on the Antarctic. That was sort of the inspiration for the work to begin with.
Okay, you've had an introduction to Yi Shun, you've had an introduction to the book, you've had an introduction to how silly Yi Shun and I can be when we are together. So you've got some good introductions. It's now time for our first break of this episode. When we come back, you'll find out just what kind of interesting categories this book was trending in on Amazon. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Do you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my conversation with Yi Shun Lai. We are talking, as you know, about her young adult novel, A Suffragist's Guide to the Antarctic. Let's return to that conversation. Yeah, I mean, it's such a unique story. And did I see that it was trending as like the #1 Antarctic nonfiction guidebook at some point on Amazon?
Yeah, it was the #1 Antarctic travel guide. People, this is not a book that you want to be taking with you when, you're trying to figure out where to go in the Antarctic, okay? Because these characters spend all their time locked in ice. Like that's not, and then, blindly, well, not blindly, the navigators were good. They knew what they're doing. But eventually they have to go on a really long boat journey, you don't want to navigate by the stars when you're traveling in the Antarctic in this day and age. You have GPS.
Yeah.
You have GPS. Yeah, the algorithm is all wrong.
Next March. This is her 70th birthday present to herself. It'll be her last continent to check off her bucket list. She'll have made all the continents. And I told her she needs to take this book with her, not as a guide, just because I think it would be funny if she was reading this book when she went to the Antarctic.
Yeah, I love this idea. And she's going on a cruise ship, is that right?
Yes, I believe so.
Fantastic. She's going to love it. It's going to be great. But yeah, it is not a travel guide, folks. Just so you're clear, Sarah's audience, it is not a travel guide.
Not a travel guide. It's, I hate being cold. And this book, I was cold the whole time I was reading it. I have no desire to go to the Antarctic for this amount of time. Go to the Antarctic, see the penguins, yes, but be stuck there, in the 19 teens with no good outdoor gear. No, thank you. You have been to the Antarctic, correct?
I have been to the Antarctic. I have been. I, however, like your aunt, went on a cruisey. It was a cruisey cruise ship, right? It was a French cruise ship, moreover. So we had lovely wine pairings every night. It was about as far away from what Clara and her crew had to experience as you might possibly imagine. However, I love being cold, and I didn't understand what it was like to be cold from my trip to the Antarctic. I understood what it was like to be cold from living in Chicago for 3.5 years. Um, we did a lot of outdoor activities. I'm a big proponent of outdoor activities, and so we would run foot races, and we would ride our bikes, and we would go snowshoeing in Chicago lakefront weather. And I'll tell you what, some of those races we ran were in up to negative 40-degree wind chill. So whenever I needed to access what it was like, I didn't retreat to my lovely cruise ship docked off of the Antarctic continent. I retreated to foot races in Chicago in negative 40 degrees. And I loved it. It was great. It was great. It's so animal, Sarah. There's something that's so animal about being that cold. And of course, the big difference is that I knew I was going to be able to find my way back home, right? I could go to Racine, Madison, where I lived, and curl up with my pup and have a cup of hot chocolate. But like the explorers, they couldn't do that. They couldn't do that. They were something else altogether. So yeah.
I don't know. Maybe it's because I grew up in Montana, so I feel like I've had my share of cold. I'm good. I'll experience other things now.
Yeah, I think you're onto that. I mean, I was born in Taiwan and now live in California, in Southern California, no less. So we maybe those of us who grew up in our respective climes long for something else.
Yeah, yeah. But you mentioned a little bit of your inspiration for the story, but what was it that made you want to write this story, especially about Clara and about this expedition? It's a very interesting and unique kind of set of circumstances around which the story is told. So what was your inspiration?
I got mad. I got really mad. I read the expedition. I read the book about the expedition in 20 years ago. Let's see, I'm 49 now, and I read that book when I was like 27. So yeah, like 20 years ago, I read that book, and I became immediately obsessed with the idea of these crew members who were, doing these like amazing things. They were so heroic. And I do mean that with all of the fainting couch expression that you hear in my voice, because as I became older, I realized that part of the reason that I was so obsessed with this book was the idea of leadership. And then I began to question what it actually means to be a true leader, right? What it actually means to inspire people to go with you on this expedition. And I began to realize that there were so many unsung stories of leadership on this expedition itself, right? So for instance, at the end of the expedition, Ernest Shackleton's men, they finally land themselves on a little quote unquote guano crusted piece of rock. That's from a crew diary, by the way, not my words. He eventually had to go and find some way to rescue the entire crew. So he took 6 men and sailed off to go find rescue. And he told them, I'll be back in, I can't remember if he said like 2.5 or 3 weeks, something like that. Anyhow, it was 3 months later. 3 months later, Sarah. Okay. So imagine that you're the second in command. His name is Frank Wild, who has been left on this guano encrusted piece of rock, with 21 other men. And you have to tell them every day that the boss is going to come no matter what. And in fact, every single day he would get up and he would say to the men, strike camp and stow, boys, the boss may come today. Every day for 3 months, he said this. Where is the leadership course that's built around Frank Wild and his style of leadership, right? Where is it that talks about the grit, right? And I talk about leadership courses because there actually are whole leadership courses built around Ernest Shackleton. There's a book about it called The Shackleton Way. For a short while, I was taught at Stanford Business School. Okay. So, there are all these tiny examples of leadership among the men, and in every single little crew interaction. And of course, what we know about leadership today is that it's not necessarily the loudest person on deck or the person with the most money on deck, but it's the person who knows how to be an active follower and the person who knows about an active leader, right? So there was that aspect of it. And then coincidentally, what's not coincidence? This has been happening throughout history. women signed up to go on these, glorious Antarctic expeditions or exploration expeditions, and they were just turned away out of hand. They were turned away because they were women. And that made me really angry. So I thought, okay, well, you know what? I'm just going to do this. It's fiction. I get to do this. What isn't fiction is the grit of the women back then who were adventuring by themselves and who were hiding it from people because it would have been seen as being unladylike to go off and adventure. They would have been seen as being not doing the woman's job. This is a book written out of fury.
The sheer scope. Sometimes I try to imagine how you even provision something like this, because you have no idea how long it could be, and their ship ends up sinking. They're trying to go across the ice, so they're in lifeboats. They have X number of days, weeks, months of rations. I can't even imagine how you even start to put something like this together. What was the research like for you?
Wow. Okay, so I have to say something about research that I haven't actually articulated out loud before. So please excuse me if I mumble my way through it.
Okay.
What I'm finding out research that's interesting is that you do all of the background research, which I'll get to in a second, and then when you sit down to write the thing, it is possible that the research becomes your cage, right? You become so entrenched in timelines, right, and in dates, and in actual stuff that actually happened, that you forget that you're actually writing fiction, right? And you can actually make stuff up. Okay, that part of it I've articulated before, but the secondary part of it for me that is working with my brain and that I'm finding really interesting is that once I started to write the fiction part of it, I kind of started to very conveniently forget about what the actual historical truth was, so that the story I was writing actually became the truth in my head, So if you ask me now to recall the historical research that I've done, I would be very hard pressed to do so. I would have to go back into my notes. Thank goodness I took notes, and really drill down into actually what I did. And I think some of this is protection of one's own brain, right? Holding those two timelines together, it can be very taxing after a little while, and holding those two realities together starts to make you feel a little bit bananas, right? So some of this is brain protection. But in terms of the actual research, what I did was to start at the beginning, right? My obsession with leadership. So I did a lot of reading around leadership, what we think of it today, what it looked like back then. And then I went to the Scott Polar Research Institute in Cambridge, where a lot of the papers around expeditions and Antarctic expeditions Antarctic and Arctic expeditions are held. So I did a lot of reading around that. I read every single crew diary from the Endurance that I could get my hands on. And just generally, immerse myself in these men's lives on board the ship. But late in the process, I realized that the timeline was very convenient to include not just a woman on board, but an actual suffragist on board. So then I did a lot of reading and a lot of thinking about what it was like to be a suffragist back in the day, right? Both on the American side and on the English side. And what I discovered there, if I needed more fuel for the fire, really set me off in beautiful, beautiful fashion. The women of the English suffragist movement they were on fire. I mean, they had a jiu-jitsu coach whose name was Edith Garud. She was 4'11". She went to Japan. She learned jiu-jitsu and brought it back to the suffragists. They planted letter bombs. They cut telegraph wires. They were extraordinary women, and they were branded terrorists because of it. And I think, this question of what can cause you to undertake a cause that it could cause you to lose life and limb is it's just one of those powerful questions, that makes me keep on thinking about this demographic, these women.
Yeah, everything that I have learned and read about what they went through and just the brutality of some of their experiences never ceases to amaze me, and I'm grateful for all of them.
Yeah, absolutely. Women. I remember sitting at a dinner table with some friends of mine, And one of the girls at the table, it was right around election time. This is decades ago now. She said that she hadn't voted. And one of the other women stood up and said, "Women died for your right to vote. It is your onus to go and vote. Like, it is your duty. You need to do that." And I've just never forgotten that. Never forgotten it.
Absolutely. You have covered this a little bit in just talking about Clara and her grit and her perseverance, but what about her is really going to resonate with readers, do you think?
Well, Clara's quite broken, actually. She's not the kind of woman who you sometimes encounter, well, you never encounter them in fiction, okay? But like, you encounter them on social media, right? Where it's like, everything is activism, and they're doing so much and you admire them so much, right? But what I think goes unsung in a lot of these social media feeds, or in a lot of these stories about women who have made it their mission to really be activists and really protest and fight for rights, is the struggle it takes to get there and to onboard that mentality. In my own life, like I call myself a semi-activist. Like in some ways, I do what I can within the scope of what I'm comfortable with. But being an Asian American living on the border of San Bernardino County and Los Angeles County, I wouldn't be comfortable, for instance, going out and canvassing door to door, right? That's not something I'm comfortable doing. But I am a volunteer for Postcards to Voters, which allows me to be an activist from my own home, right? Where we sit at home and we write postcards to voters who may or may not be ready to vote, right? And we encourage them to go vote. Like, that's our sole mission, is to get people to vote. Okay. So, I think what I want people to walk away with, and one of the things that really strikes me about Clara, is what a messy road to finding her own form of activism she traveled. It took her a long time to come around to the fact that she is a privileged woman who was able to participate in the suffragist movement. Able, right? There were lots of women who were just working too hard to participate in the suffragist movement. They were working to keep food on the table. There are women who would never get the chance to actually take time off and host a suffragist tea like the Vanderbilts did, from their homes on Rhode Island. So I want people to remember that, you don't come to activism by just waking up one day and being like, oh, I want to do this. You come to it by a long, messy road. And you come to it by really examining yourself and seeing whether or not you can afford to do this, and whether or not it makes sense for you. And then you have to ask the question of how you end up wanting to do it.
All very, very good questions, and I will leave you to ponder them while we take our second break of this episode. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my conversation with Yi Shun Lai. We are about to go into a conversation that I thought, since we were at a break, would be the perfect time to give you a little bit more information because, of course, in the moment, I could not remember the name of the book that I mentioned here in just a moment. That book is called The Accidental Suffragist. The author is Galia Gichon. I am not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly. Galia Gichon, and I am about to mention, because it's similar to what Yi Shun was just talking about in terms of suffragists and different life events and circumstances, bringing them to the suffragist movement, how that affected women of color, women of different classes, etc. And it reminded me of this book. And I went to go look up the book, The Accidental Suffragist, again, in case you're interested. Really good book. The author was supposed to be on the podcast, so I was going to look that up and give you the episode number. Turns out we were not able to do her interview, so there is no interview, which I am bummed about. But I did want to give you the name of the book and the author in case, as you are listening to the next couple of minutes, you were curious. Back to the conversation with Yi Shun. Mm-hmm. Actually, yeah, I had an author. I can't remember the timeline, but it was historical fiction, and it was a woman in New York, and her teenage daughter was killed in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire.
Oh, yeah.
That's her into activism, but so it was historical fiction from her perspective of trying to get to be part of this push for the right to vote, but she was very, very poor. Her family was poor. She was trying to work and do this, and just sometimes the sheer entitlement of the women she was working with. It was a really interesting portrait.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the thing, right? Is that like we, in particular regards to the Triangle Shirtwaist fire, I remember being fully formed 20-something year old before I heard about that, right? Like, how come it took me so long to hear about that, right? Yeah. So, in part, this idea of how we come to activism, I think, also is about whose stories we have access to, and whose stories we hear told, right? So, in part, I think about that a lot, and and I do wonder what role historical fiction can have in that, right? Because there is this sort of there is the side of me that hews quite closely to history. That I don't know, that thinks about this and wonders whether or not we can lean on historical fiction to provide these gaps in history, and I think in a lot of ways we can.
Yeah, I think it's a good stepping stone, at least, because I actually did read a story. I think I was in maybe fourth grade. I have a vague memory of writing a book report about a mother who, I think again it was a mother with young children or something. But anyway, she got involved in the suffragist movement, and I was very young, but I still remember this. I do not know what it was called. I couldn't tell you, but I do remember reading that. So and then I ended up as a women's studies minor in college. So clearly, it's a direct correlation.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And and I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I was just recalling, this is only a couple years ago now, post-pandemic time, right? I went to visit a friend in Santa Barbara, and I was at the Santa Barbara Mission, and they had a display about the quote unquote lost woman of San Nico Island, who was the inspiration for Scott Odell's Island of the Blue Dolphins. And that's a true story. You know that, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, one of the things that, it occurred to me as I was standing there, once again, at the time that I encountered this display, I was maybe 46, 47 years old. And I remember standing there and having the brainwave that I think the reason I'm so obsessed with women in uncomfortable situations is because I read Island of the Blue Dolphins when I was like 8, and it just is like, it's so funny the way these things kind of like come around, right? So you ask about inspiration. And maybe in some ways we have to track all the way back to when I was 8, right? Maybe we have to track all the way back to when I encountered Karana and her dog Rontu, right? And those otters that she befriended, So yeah, who knows? Who knows when we'll be inspired by something, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And so kind of along that point, what do you hope readers might take away from the book?
Oh, I want young women to know that nothing is out of their range, because look, this book is fiction. Yes, of course, all right? But there were women who were out there doing these things on their own. Lucy Walker is the first woman to summit Matterhorn, and that was in like, I want to say it was like 1870, something like that. And she would walk around, she would walk around town, and then she would take off her petticoats and hide them behind a rock, and then walk up the hill that way, up the mountain, excuse me, not the hill, because petticoats made it hard for her to walk, right? But it took some time before I understood that history, right? There are these wonderful stories of like women librarians on horseback, right? One of my favorite stories is about Edna Brush Perkins, who drove across the Mojave Desert with a close friend of hers. She was planning on doing it in a car, and in the end, she had to hire a buckboard wagon, with a guide to take them across. And I mean, women were doing these things. They were doing these things. It's just that we don't know about them, right? We don't know. So we can't really, yeah, it's fiction. But there is some part of Clara that existed in all women back then, right? I think about when I was writing this book, I was in a little town called Mousehole on the coast of England on the what is that, on the western coast, and I used to go to a pub there when I was finished writing, and I was perusing the clippings on the pub, and I saw this newspaper clipping of these two girls in bikinis, who were standing in a rowboat next to a shark that they had apparently caught. And I'm choosing to define it that way, right? Because there were actually no words written about this particular shark and these women. But I think about it as being like bikini spirit, like there were no bikinis in 1914. But there was bikini spirit, there were girls out there who would go out and do these things, and women who would go out there and do these things. And it existed, it was there. So it's fiction, but it's not fiction, right? And the reality that women will always be vying for things that they want to do, that they are then told that they can't do, and then who go off and do it themselves. That's not fiction. That's real everyday life. It's real everyday life. And I just want girls to remember that and know that moving forward in their lives. It's a young adult book for a reason, right? It's a young adult book because it is meant for me to be able to talk to girls and tell them what I didn't know when I was growing up.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I like that you include toward the beginning of the book, it's not a hugely important plot point, but Clara gets her period on the expedition.
Yeah.
When I read, especially like fantasy books or things, the action adventure books, and it's young women off on these like grand epic adventures, they never go to the bathroom. They leave with like a loaf of bread and some cheese, and they're gone for 6 months. So thank you for just popping that little detail in there, that yes, she is a female and she had a period while she was out in the Antarctic.
It is telling. It's telling, actually. In total transparency, I must tell you that when I was first conceiving of the book, that also did not occur to me, right? Okay. Which is one of these things. It just tells us about how much we assimilate ourselves into these narratives, right? Like when we're told over and over again that girls go on ventures for 8 months, that like we never have to contend with our periods. But I was sitting at lunch with an editor friend of mine, and I was telling her the story, and she goes, "Huh, that all sounds good. Oh, what happens when you get her period?" And I was like, "Oh, right." That whole thing. So like, I mean, thank goodness for the presence of good editors early on in one's life, thank goodness.
When it comes to Clara, was she really fully formed in your mind when you started writing, or did she evolve quite a bit during the writing process?
Well, okay, so I'll give you a little secret. This was actually meant to be a time travel story at the end of the day. We at some point in time, it just became too complicated, and I was like, why does it need to be a time travel story? There were women back then who were doing these things and want to do these things. Like, what am I doing? Like, I'm totally not giving these women credence, right? So yes, it evolved a lot, because originally the character was named Juniper Smith. And she lived in Milwaukee, and inadvertently landed on the deck of the Endurance when it was cracking up. So yeah, I mean, the character of Clara at first was a lot wishy-washier. Now she's just wishy-washy in different form.
Hey, makes sense.
Yeah. So yeah, it was, it's, the journey to kind of nailing down your character, I think is different for every writer, obviously. And I always say that the plot is driven by the character, which perhaps maybe just gives you insight into how messy this thing was for me to begin with. I always knew it was going to be about equity, but I couldn't quite nail down the character I wanted to give us that lesson, right? Mm-hmm. Or to teach us what she knew. But yeah, at the end of the day, it was this is who we settled on. This is what we got, people.
Well, and I do love a good time travel story. Sometimes it depends on how convoluted they get, but
yeah.
That's a good trope, but or genre. But I think I'm glad it went this direction.
Me too. I mean, the women who lived back then, they deserve their place in the sun, right? I always think about Emily Davidson, who is a woman that is mentioned very briefly in the book. She died while she was trying to hang a Votes for Women flag on a racehorse during the Ascot races, and people to this day still say it was a suicide attempt. Like that's
wow.
Yeah, I mean, it breaks my heart to think of that. Her legacy, it should at least, the narratives that we hear told about everybody, I think we owe it to ourselves to question them every once in a while, right? And just ask ourselves, who is telling that story?
Mm-hmm.
What do they have at stake? What do the storytellers have at stake? So yeah, it's a pity when we don't have the artifacts by which we can hear stories told from an own person, from somebody's own point of view, right?
Yeah, well, and that's why I love that this is written. Clara writes a lot of this book in her own personal journal, because that is where we get so much of women's history, right? They're not mentioned a lot in actual history texts, but we get women's history through their journals.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. In the thing I'm working on next, I consulted a lot of women's diaries, and it just, it just blows you away. The emotion that's conveyed in something like a personal diary it's just remarkable. It's remarkable.
Yeah, actually, that's a nice segue. Good job. Thank you. What are you working on now? If you feel comfortable sharing.
I feel totally comfortable sharing it. I'm super excited about this project, and I can't wait for it to see the light of day. It is a Western. It is a mystery. And it tries to shine a light on prostitutes of the Old West and the role that they had in building the civilizations that we know of as being the Old West.
I love that. Is it a novel, short story? What form is it taking?
It's a novel. It is another young adult novel. Okay. And the point of view character is, once again, one trick pony. Thank you very much. A young suffragist who's trying to answer some questions for herself.
Nice. Backing up a little bit, is there an audiobook version of Suffragist Guide?
Oh my gosh. How did you know I was dying to talk about this? Thank you so much. The narrator is Jade Wheeler. There is an audiobook version. People, when I tell you that, I was able to get a copy of it, obviously, because publishers are nice. And when I hit the play button and I heard Clara's voice, I just about wept. I mean, I could not believe it. Not that it was close, right? But that or not that it wasn't close, but that Clara has lived in my head for so long that hearing her was like hearing her come to life, right? It is such a remarkable, remarkable thing to hear this. And Wheeler does a remarkable job of the other accents, right? Because there are 4 or 5 other accents on the ship with Clara. And to hear them come to life like that is just, It was just tears came to my eyes. It was remarkable. It was so lovely. I can't promise that I'll never hear Clara in my own voice again, but it is so lovely to, it's like seeing an imaginary friend come to life, right? It's like one of those things. It's just, it was incredible. It was great. And I encourage all of you who love audiobooks to go out and have a listen to it. Check it out from your local library or something. It's so worth it. It's wonderful. Wonderful.
I love it. And I love audiobooks. So, awesome. Yes. Time for our final break of this episode. But I do truly love audiobooks. I'm sure you've figured that out from how many times I say it during the podcast and during different conversations. Don't tell me listening to audiobooks is not real reading. Not true. That is a ditch I'm willing to die in. It is truly reading, but at any rate, when we come back, we'll be talking about other writings of Yi Shun's. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts Social Media Podcast. Time to hashtag everything. We talk about all the fun, crazy stories on social media. From Instagram to Facebook, Twitter to Tumblr, or probably even Friendster. Join us each week as we explore the quirky side of social media. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Social Media Podcast.
It's simple, such a sad song. The one that we rely on to get us.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my conversation with Yi Shun Lai. Any other writings of any type that you would like to highlight? I know you do a lot of work in just the world of writing, so anything else you want to highlight?
You're being so generous right now. I took my first ever full-time job in 22 years back in July. And since then, I have had absolutely no brain space to do anything creative. With that said, however, I am marrying some friends in April, and I get to write, that part of like the ceremony. And I'm so excited. Like, it just feels like one of the most important things I've ever written. And also on Wednesday, I'm delivering a speech about what it means for a writer of color to stay in your own lane. You know how now, well, for decades now, we've been saying that people who don't have certain identities should not be writing other identities, right? For instance, I think we hear this complaint from white male writers a lot, where they say, well, why can't I write, a black male protagonist, or why can't I write a black female protagonist? And I think we're at a place in publishing now where we are wanting to see more narratives from, diverse voices, but we are only wanting those diverse voices to write diverse stories. And that feels a little bit, funny to me, right? So I'm writing that talk, and it is giving me, angina, but I'm reminded of what it feels like to, really dig your teeth into something that is, super engaging and super interesting. So those are my two big creative projects right now.
Well, and it does bring up a good point, because Clara is a young Caucasian woman, right? She's a young white woman. You are, I almost said you're not a young white woman. I didn't mean it. I almost said that, because you're not old. But how was that in the writing process? Did you ever have any should I not kind of questions?
Oh, not at all, Sarah. I'm so grateful to you for bringing this up, because it is helping me to think through, how I'm going to frame this talk that I'm giving on Wednesday. This is the reality of my existence. I look like an Asian person. I am an Asian person, but what I know about the white American experience is vastly more than Big Five Publishing thinks I know. Right. I'm Asian American, right? And I say that not because I'm half Caucasian and half Asian, but I say that because I spent a lot of my life onboarding white American media. I know what it means when white people get their periods. I know what it means when white people have acid reflux. I know what it means when white people eat breakfast in their mornings, right? Okay, like I have seen this played out over the course of my TV screen and my movie screen for every decade of my life. Right. Also, not for nothing, but when you're an Asian and you are trying to get by in America, you assimilate. For a long time, I thought I could pass as white. I really, really believe that. So it's like a critical part of my experience. And, I'll close this commentary, this very long rambling commentary, sorry, by saying that a couple of nights ago, a student asked me what it was like to send my book out into the world, right? To know that it was kind of done. And I said something flippant like, oh, I'm always working on the next project or whatever. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that like I felt lonely because Clara was no longer my own, right? She had gone off and she's going off and doing something else and talking to other people and influencing other people. Whereas for such a long time, it had been just like me and her, and then, me and her and my agent, and then me and her and my editor. And the thing is, when I picture Clara, this best friend of mine who I lived with for all the years that I was writing the book, I don't picture my Asian American sisters. I picture my white sisters. I picture, my friend Jody and my friend Allison, and Margaret. I don't picture Grace and Esther and Catherine, do you know what I mean? So I know this experience. I know this experience really, really well. And I think it's just selling people short when we try to confine ourselves to this one narrative. It's just not fair.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. And thank you for just the intentionality with which you have been thinking about it. I appreciate that. Asking this next question is never fair because I know that you read like crazy. So I won't ask you about favorites or anything, but maybe just what have you been reading lately that has caught your attention?
Okay. So I read, this is so on the nose, Sarah. I'm so embarrassed by this because it is, again, that whole one trick pony thing. I have just finished reading Erasure by Percival Everett, which was written in 2001. And it is the book on which the movie American Fiction is based. That's a movie about, and a book about a black man who, writes very literary fiction, and eventually caves to writing what he refers to as ghetto fiction. And that's how he ends up, making all of his money, right? So it's the sort of duality of experience that he has to kind of confront within himself. That was a wonderful, wonderful book. It was also just really creatively written, and I really enjoyed it. I also have been rereading the Dick Francis mystery novels, which I love to pieces. They're so wonderful. They're so much fun. They're the books that I go to when I'm feeling quite how you say, I don't know, at sixes and sevens with my life, right? Like I retreat back to them and I always learn something new from them because the craft of mystery, insofar as Dick Francis goes, is just like right up there in most of his books. And then I've just finished reading a book called Hot and Bothered by the editor of the New York Times Well section. And I can't remember the name of the author now. I'm sorry. But it's about menopause. And all the ways in which it can affect us. And it has really helped me to feel that my perimenopausal symptoms are not imaginary. So
the author is Jan C. Dunn, because you sent that link to me and I have it open on my computer.
Thank you. Yes, my perimenopausal brain has failed to remember any authors' names apparently. So yeah, that's what's on my reading list right now.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And this is a bit of a tangent, but because we're talking about books, of course. How is your little free library?
It's good. Thank you for asking. You know that it got robbed entirely, and I was furious about it. In my neighborhood, it's very well known as being the Little Free Library. It, by the way, unbranded. Okay, so not associated with Little Free Library movement.
Right. But I was curious on your behalf. Just to put that up.
Yeah, absolutely. It really only features books by marginalized writers. So in there I have books from disabled writers, and books from marginalized writers, and books from LGBTQIA population, as well as books from people who were not economically advantaged growing up. And at some point in time, the entire stack disappeared. And there were people who were like, "Oh, but it's a lending library. Like, it makes sense that somebody would take them all." And I'm like, "No, this is clearly an act of spite." So we've been slowly restocking, and it's just been really, really wonderful. The book community really, came out in full force and helped me to seed it at the very beginning. And now I'm back to curating it, which is super exciting. And I've gotten to go around and drop off copies of my book at other libraries around the neighborhood. So that always makes me really, really happy. That's a good thing.
Yay. That's fun. I assume you signed them.
Oh my gosh. No, oh shoot.
You should sign your book.
Oh dear. Oh, Sarah, where are you when I'm doing these things? My goodness gracious. I will go back and sign them.
Perimenopausal buddies, because
Exactly.
I will remember things that you won't, and you will remember things that I won't.
Perfect. Together we will share a brain. It's wonderful. I love this. Fantastic.
I love it. In terms of your internet presence, website where people can learn more about you and your books, and any social media that you are active on.
Yeah, please go to thegooddirt.org, which will give you basic background information about me. And every once in a while, I'll update with the events that I'm doing. Will you please come visit me on TikTok, because I love it there. I've been absent for a little while, but that's just because my brain has been filled up with things like book launch. But I love it there. It's wonderful. I'm at Yi Shun Lai on TikTok. And I'm also on Instagram at the exact same handle. So please come visit me there too.
And I love you on TikTok. It makes me happy whenever you pop up, because it's like,
Thank
I
you.
don't talk to you enough, but I get to have little moments in your day.
Yeah, exactly. A friend of mine told me that, like, I don't use TikTok in the way that a lot of people use it. And he just told me, he's like, "You're just thinking out loud." And I'm like, yeah, that's exactly what it is. I'm just noodling out loud. So please come with me and noodle along with me, will you? That would be nice.
Yes, lovely. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you wanted to make sure you highlighted during our time together?
Yeah, you asked me what I was reading lately, and I want to give a shout out to two memoirs that I'm reading lately. They're really, really wonderful. Most of the time I'm in either fiction brain or like self-help brain. But I also love memoirs. And my friend Grace Lowe Prasad is coming out with a memoir called The Translator's Daughter. That's coming up. It launches in a week. So I'm super excited for that to come out. That's from Ohio State University Press. And then there's another memoir out there by a woman named Susan Ito, with whom I'm also friendly. And her book comes out. It just came out recently. That's called I Would Meet You Anywhere. And it's a story about adoption and her own story of finding her birth mother and the actual story behind it. And then finally, last but definitely not least, my teaching partner, Melanie Brooks, has a book out that is called A Hard Silence. And it's about her family struggle with her father's AIDS diagnosis in 1980s Canada. They had to keep it a secret from their community for the length of his life. And he was part of the Bad Blood scandal. I don't know if you remember that or not, but there was a batch of blood transfusions that was tainted with HIV. And he ended up being one of those recipients, and it was horrible. They had to keep it a secret for a decade. They didn't know when he would pass away and if he would pass away, because at the time AIDS was really, really new, right? It's a remarkable memoir. And I encourage you to, go out and read the ones that pique your interest, but they all receive really, really high marks from me, if that counts for anything. So thanks for giving me the space to remind myself of those books.
Absolutely. Oh, that just makes me think you and I are right around the same age. And just, I remember in the 80s when we started hearing about it on the news, and just how terrifying it was, and how, oh my gosh, the craziness surrounding when we started learning about the AIDS epidemic. Wow. So yeah, I need to look into that memoir.
Yeah, I think you'll love it. I really, really, really do. It's available on e-copy and in hard copy. So please feel free to go out and grab a book. And also Melanie is doing an audiobook, so maybe you want to wait for that version.
Excellent.
Yeah, good stuff.
Well, Yi Shun, I love when you join me to talk. We should do it more than every 8 years, but we'll figure that out.
Yes, please.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
Me too, Sarah. Thank you so much for doing this. I so admire your literary citizenship, and I'm really glad to contribute to it.
Oh my goodness. Thank you once again to Yi Shun for joining me for our second podcast conversation. Not our second conversation in the world, but our second conversation on the podcast. I told her after we were done recording that she makes me feel smarter when I talk to her, and I appreciate that very much. So thank you to Yi Shun for that. I mean, she ended the podcast by using the phrase literary citizenship. I don't think that phrase has ever even occurred to me, so I appreciate the expansion of my brain and my vocabulary when I speak with Yi Shun. Hopefully you enjoyed the conversation. Hopefully you'll want to check out A Suffragist's Guide to the Antarctic. Great book for really any age, and it's got something for everyone. I mean, it's got historical fiction, it's got action and adventure and intrigue and all kinds of good stuff. So please, if you're looking for your next read for either you or a young woman in your life, or heck, an old woman in your life, or a young man in your life, I'm just really throwing it out there for everybody, but there are a lot of things to recommend this book to a lot of different people in terms of genre, in terms of age, etc. So go check it out, and check out Marty Wu, the Misadventures of Marty Wu. Oh my gosh, I apologize. She said it in the interview. You can Google Yi Shun, you can look her up on Amazon or what have you, and you'll find the full name of the Marty Wu book. I am so sorry that I just completely blanked on the name of that book. You can also listen to episode 63, and you'll hear the full name of the book and lots more about it as well. So thank you to Yi Shun. Thank you, as always, to you for listening. I hope that you will join me for the next episode. We will be switching gears from historical fiction to fantasy. I will be speaking to Danny Resch about the first 2 books in her Magic Shoes series, Compass to Vinland and Clarity of Sight. So join me for that. That's a little younger in age than Suffragist's Guide to the Antarctic, and we're switching to fantasy. So join me for that conversation. In the meantime, if you are not doing so already and weren't inspired at the beginning of the episode when I said this, maybe you'll now be inspired to like, follow, and subscribe to this podcast. Leave a review. It really does help the podcast, and it gets it out to more listeners such as yourself. You can also find the podcast on Facebook, X, Instagram, and TikTok. I truly do love hearing from listeners. Tell me what you're reading, what you want to read. Give me that list of your last read, your current read, your next read. I'm nosy and I want to know, so let me know what you are reading and all those other burning questions you may have about podcast interviews that I have done and will continue to do. Thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful weekend ahead of you. Regardless of what you're doing, I hope that weekend involves plenty of time to get yourself lost in a good book. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.